34. The train rocked gently as it made its leisurely way through the tunnel. Rodin let himself be swayed by the motion, for once not minding the lack of urgency. It gave him the opportunity to reflect, and to prepare. It gave him a moment of peace. He wondered how much peace Shay was feeling now. Back in her rooms he'd explained his plan, and even though it meant never seeing the counselor again, she saw that there was no other option. She'd contacted Leopold, arranging the meeting. Rodin had listened in carefully, noted how she hinted that she wanted to see the counselor, but never explicitly stating that the meeting would be with her. Even in that stressful situation, with 2 corpses still bleeding onto her floor, she'd been strong. Leopold agreed to the rendezvous, and in his reply to Shay, Rodin was certain he detected a hint of excitement at traveling to such a destination. The edges of the dome were the closest this society had to no-go zones, but the counselor clearly saw this as a new experience, one that he might learn from. Truly a rarity under the glass, that man seeking the new regardless of the risks. Of course, he might regret his decision when Rodin appeared. The tunnel was dark, and when Rodin looked to the window he saw his reflection. The clothes were the closest dome fashions to the practical wear he was accustomed to, and he reached a hand over his left breast, feeling the weight in the inside pocket. The tool that had been smuggled across the glass along with his 2 blades. One of these still sat on his hip. The other, of course, was still in that man's skull, unless Shay had removed it. He turned his head, and saw the other reflection in the glass. Paskia looked small and frightened, but she sat rigid, her face set. After all she'd been through, she was still courageous, unwilling to be beaten down by authority. It had surprised both Rodin and Shay when Paskia said she wanted to accompany him to the meeting. Shay had said it was a ridiculous notion, that the girl needed to rest, especially after what she had just endured. And Rodin said he would rather be alone for this. But Paskia had been adamant. If Leopold no longer trusted Rodin, she had said, then a friendly face would help ease his mind about the meeting. Rodin agreed, knowing that he was using her. Knowing that, whatever happened, he would be abandoning her as soon as Leopold arrived. Her reflection shifted, and Rodin looked directly at her. There was still a red line at her throat, but despite some bleeding earlier it was already fading. There wouldn't be any scarring.
"You're really from beyond the glass?"
she asked in a small voice. Her eyes met his with determination. He nodded and she sighed with a sad smile.
"Then I was mistaken before. You can't be the friend I once knew. But the 2 of you are so alike. And when Shay first said your name, I saw him clearly in my mind. So strange, the obscure fragments that trigger memories. She said your name, and in my mind I heard not Rodin but Brody, and I knew that was his name. For a moment I was back with him, in his arms, and he was teasing me about my hair. I think I had it colored red back then, and he would talk of my mind being on fire, would call me firefly or firebug or something similar."
A tiny laugh.
"That sounds almost an insult to call someone a bug. But he said it like it was a private joke, like we had a special bond. And there were other things I recall, ways he acted, things he'd say and do. I remembered his mannerisms, the way he'd sit quietly for long periods, watching and listening.
A sigh.
And then I remembered our sessions with Sergio, and that walk in the park. I remembered how you 2 watched and listened. And I thought how alike the 2 of you were."
She drifted off, gazing into the darkness through the window. He didn't respond and the train rocked in silence. Paskia sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her chest rising and falling beneath her jacket. He thought of the modeling sessions, and of her body petite, some muscle tone, pale skin and those tiny imperfections. A contrast to his toughened but scarred flesh, his ugly protection. When she turned away from the window, her face was still sad. No, not sad but hollow, like there was nothing left inside. Like correction or authority had taken away years of memories and left a dark void.
"What's it like outside?"
Her voice wavered and her eyes darted away. "Outside."
"Beyond the glass."
Her eyes met his and her face twitched. Rodin took a breath. Different. But he couldn't leave it at that. "I've heard what people in here think, and they have it all wrong. Yes, it's sometimes violent, and there aren't all the rules you have. But it's not as restrictive. You can do what you want, say what you think. There's more freedom.
Freedom. That seems a strange word to use in a place with violence and no rules. How can you be free if you never know what someone will do to you?
Rodin thought of the last morning he woke in the dome, of having someone trying to kill him. He thought of the attack by the river, of the countless times someone had tried to mug him in the streets, in alleys, on the stairs of buildings. And he remembered how he'd fought back. I suppose because they don't know what you'll do either. He shrugged. It's hard to explain. Maybe it's something you have to experience. She pulled at a non-existent thread on her jacket.
Is that possible? Could someone from the dome go outside?
It's possible. Then he saw her eyes widen, the corners of her mouth turn up. He shook his head, raising a hand. No. He wanted to laugh at such a notion. You're not ready.
But if I had someone to help me, maybe someone to teach me.
No. Firmer now, desperate to stop this before it started. I have enough problems looking after myself. It wouldn't be fair on you. No.
But maybe someday.
He shook his head. Maybe. Not what he wanted to say. Anything's possible, but not yet. Not for a long time. Rodin looked into the window, biting on his lower lip. He saw in his peripheral vision Paskia's hands move, her mouth open and twitch. Knew she wanted to speak. But she didn't. They rode the train in silence once more. Eventually, the blackness beyond the window morphed into bright lights, then a platform, a faded mural on the far side. The train stopped and the doors slid open. As Rodin followed Paskia off the train, he thought of the last time he walked with her, watching for the attack he knew was imminent. But he'd been wrong. This whole contract was wrong. But maybe it was good that Kat had come to Rodin. If things went to plan, maybe this was for the best. Rodin still had his doubts, though. There were too many unknowns, and too many people involved. When this was over for him, and he was back in the familiarity of the districts, what would happen in the dome? How would Sergio cope, or Daventry? Would Shay find herself under greater scrutiny by authority? And what would happen to Paskia? None of that should matter, but it did. And that worried Rodin. The streets beyond the train station were deserted, and the streetlights spread a murky glow that merged with the shadows. They walked over cracked paving, and the grass to one side was filled with weeds. The brickwork on the buildings was blackened, severely in places, and Rodin could almost smell the charcoal in the air. Paskia pulled her jacket tight to her body, and she shuddered. Rodin felt his hand fall to his hip, crossing his body to where he wore his blade. Not that he'd need it, but it was better to be prepared. Just in case. He led the way now, the route firmly in his memory. The alley between two tall buildings, then turned left. Ahead he could see the glass without craning his neck, and he knew that if they were to walk past that final row of houses, they'd cross a bank of rubble and then they'd be able to reach out and touch the glass itself. Home was so close. But Rodin had this final job to do. The building was in the final row, a single-story wreck part way along the terrace. The paint on the door was peeling, and there was a metal plate over one of the windows. There was a fence running in front of the building, but the gate hung from one hinge and complained when Rodin pushed it to one side. The path was overgrown, and there was a stink of rotting vegetation. But when he opened the small panel to the left of the door, the code pad was clean, looked almost new. The fixer back in Jenna's district had told him the code, repeated it so that Rodin might remember it. That felt like so long ago, even though it was only a few hours. It was hard to believe he'd been home such a short time ago. He entered the code and pushed the door. It swung back heavily, strong metal behind the cracked wood, and Rodin ushered Paskia inside. She pulled a face.
I didn't realize it would be this musty. Can we not open a window?
No. We won't be here for long. It was just as he remembered it from his previous visit to the dome. A single room, 2 chairs, a couple of strip lights that cast down a runny glow when he flicked the switch. One window sealed with a metal plate, the other covered by a curtain. There was a second curtain, folds of black heavy material pushed against the back wall. And there was the panel in the wall. Hard to see with the wall so cracked, but he knew where it was, knew how to make it swing open. Beyond the panel lay the stairs, then the tunnel, and finally the doorway. The one that led to the small room, the gatepost. He wondered briefly if the gatekeeper would be the one he saw last time. Somehow he doubted it, but this one would be equally ready to take his money. Rodin patted his jacket over to the right. The notes lay there, a tightly wrapped bundle. A large chunk of his savings. At least when Kat paid him for completing this contract, he'd get that money back. You know what to do. He motioned for Paskia to take a seat. She nodded, smoothed her trousers down as she leaned forward on the chair.
When the counselor arrives, I welcome him in.
And a brief flash of panic crossed her face.
And I make sure he is away from the door. But what if he refuses?
If Leopold didn't enter the building, Rodin would have to attack him on the street. But he couldn't tell Paskia that. You'll be fine. Just be yourself. How could he resist? Outside, such a suggestion would be taken as predatory and sexual. But here, Rodin knew how Leopold would see Paskia, a scared girl in need of comfort. The man's faith in humanity and the goodness of his heart would bring him in. Paskia nodded, and even managed to smile. And I'll be close by. He reached for the black curtain and pulled, the material cutting the room in two. Don't worry.
But I don't want to hurt him.
You won't.
And you?
Rodin paused before answering. Would he hurt Leopold? Ultimately, of course, there would be some pain, but that was true of life in general. Paskia was in pain now, worrying herself silly. Pain was unavoidable. But Rodin prided himself on his professionalism. There were ways to kill that involved only a brief flash of pain. He'd watched targets die with only surprise on their faces. He'd killed targets as they slept. Unless the contract stated otherwise, he always went for the quickest, most pain-free removal possible. This is the best Leopold can hope for, he said. And he ducked behind the curtain. This side of the room was smaller, but contained the panel in the wall and one of the lights, which he turned off with a flick of a wall switch. It also contained the window that wasn't plated over, and Rodin was able to ease the curtain aside and watch the street. Paskia's chair creaked and her breathing was fast and shallow. A part of him wanted to call out, check she was okay, maybe even peer round to let her see his face. But that would be a mistake. She needed time to prepare herself, and so did he. He snaked a hand inside his jacket and gripped the tool. His fingers curled round the handle, and for a moment his eyes closed. It felt good, holding his old friend once more. Slowly, feeling every movement of his arm, hearing fabric rub against fabric, he freed the lance from his inside pocket. A thing of beauty. He held it in his right hand, and ran a finger from his left hand along the length, from the button at the end of the handle, along the molded grip, down the cool, smooth reservoir, and on to the tip of the device. He pressed down gently with his right thumb just to the first notch, and the needle slid free. He ran his finger along it, so thin yet so powerful, and rested the sharp point against his fingertip with just enough pressure that the needle pushed his flesh in, threatening to break the skin. That was all it took. Pierce the skin, then press the button. Force the drug into the target's body and let it take effect. There was movement outside now, at the far end of the street. A figure, features obscured by the weak lighting and the wide-brimmed hat. For a moment Rodin believed the figure to be Kat, come to interfere, checking that Rodin removed the counselor in a manner to his satisfaction. But the figure was wary, taking tentative steps, head constantly turning. When he reached the broken gate, the figure hesitated, turning to look around. Rodin caught features beneath the hat, saw the concern on Leopold's face. But there was a tiny grin, and Rodin knew the counselor was excited by such a clandestine meeting. He walked up the overgrown path and knocked on the door with 2 rapid taps. Rodin heard Paskia gasp, then floorboards creaked as she walked to the door. Through the window Rodin saw Leopold raise his hand to knock again, but then a cold rush of air wafted through the curtain and the counselor smiled.
Counselor Leopold,
Paskia said.
Please come in.
Ah. It's Miss Paskia, isn't it? Was it a week ago, when your aunt introduced us? I must say, I hardly expected to see such an exquisite face in surroundings like this. Do you know, there was talk of removing all these houses and making something else of the area. A few years ago now, of course, and nothing came of it.
He was babbling. Fear, but keeping a lid on it.
Won't you come in, counselor? This dwelling doesn't offer much, but it's preferable to the street.
Yes, of course.
The creak of floorboards, then a click as the door sealed. Rodin crouched down, pulled his screen out and eased it partway round the curtain near to the floor. The reflection of Leopold loomed, his hat in his hand. He turned, frowning.
I was led to understand I would be meeting Miss Shea. Is she around?
Please have a seat.
Paskia indicated the chair that had its back to the curtain, the one she had not been sitting in before. That was good. It would be easier for Rodin to make his move on a sitting target. Even if Leopold turned, Rodin would be on him before the counselor could find his feet. But Leopold hesitated. Rodin tightened his grip on the lance and lifted it higher.
I'm surprised your aunt suggested a place like this. I know she's a most fearless woman, but this close to the glass, isn't it dangerous?
But the glass is secure.
Paskia's voice wavered, like she didn't quite believe that.
Oh, of course it is. But what if we are seen? You know how people like to talk, my dear. No, it's most unlike Shea to choose a location so questionable. Or so inhospitable.
Leopold moved round the room now, reaching out but not quite touching the walls. The frown never left his face.
Surely, whatever she wished to discuss, a better place could have been found. Or why couldn't she call round to my rooms or my office?
I really couldn't say. But I'm sure my aunt has her reasons. She often does things that only make sense when all the facts come to light at a later date.
Leopold turned to Paskia, and he must have sensed the same thing as Rodin, Paskia's nerves. In the reflection he saw her hands playing with her jacket, saw her head dart around, her eyes never settling on Leopold. Rodin prepared himself. If Leopold wasn't going to sit, he'd have to move fast.
And then there's this curtain.
Leopold gave a snort of a laugh, as he took a couple of steps across the room. His shoe, slightly muddy, Rodin noticed, almost touched the screen.
A curtain in such a state surely can't be purely decorative, and I really can't believe there's a window behind here.
Rodin brought the screen back, stowed it in a pocket. Then he stood, easing himself up as quickly and as quietly as he could. He clenched his legs and arms, preparing his muscles. He stared ahead, his face surely level with Leopold's. The curtain moved.
No.
The curtain held still. Paskia's voice was quieter this time.
I mean, there's no need to pull the curtain. There's an ugly mark on the wall. It's better if the curtain remains in position.
Oh, I'm sure it can't be that bad. And one can hardly expect pristine decoration in a building like this. An interesting pattern on the wall would be preferable to this dreary material, no?
But it helps with the sound too.
Paskia's laugh was forced and Rodin gripped his lance tighter.
These walls are too bare, and without any furnishings, the curtain helps cut back on echoes.
That was smart. Rodin nodded, impressed at how Paskia was thinking despite her clear nerves. The room was quiet for a while, the air still enough that Rodin could make out Leopold's breathing. The counselor's feet shuffled, and when he spoke his voice was louder, and Rodin knew he was facing the curtain now.
You may well be right, but I'm intrigued by this mark now. I believe I'd like to see it.
And this time, Leopold pulled the curtain open. Rodin stared into Leopold's eyes. The man's breath was sweet and warm, and Rodin caught a hint of sweat. There was a red patch on his left cheek near his ear, and now Rodin caught the scent of aftershave too. The counselor's mouth opened at first as a straight line, but then a smile rose on his lips.
Terrell,
he said. But there was fear in his eyes as they darted down to the metal protruding from Rodin's clenched fist. Leopold took a step back, and that action broke Rodin's paralysis. He raised his arm as he lunged forward. In his peripheral vision he saw Paskia, hand across her mouth, eyes wide. But he kept his focus on Leopold. I'm sorry, he said as he brought the lance down and the sharpened tip pierced his flesh. Rodin pressed the button, releasing the drug into Leopold's body. The man's eyes rolled back in his head and his eyelids closed. Rodin reached round with his free arm, catching the target as he fell to the floorboards.